So I should not get ahead of myself. I should also introduce myself. So my name is Maria Almbro. I'm an analyst at the University of Stockholm. I'm a member of the research data management team, which is sort of a support function to help researchers with all aspects of data management. So from collecting data to publishing and archiving data. And I work quite a bit with the publication part of this job. So I both try to train researchers on how to think about open science and data publishing to make that a reality. And my background is also in biology, so I'm extra happy to be here today in the sort of life sciences to talk about these things. I did my PhD at Stockholm University in animal behavior. And after that, I did a couple of postdoc stints where I traveled around. And after coming back to Sweden and starting this position in 2019 at the university, I realized exactly how much has changed when it comes to making research data accessible. So it's sort of a paradigm shift, at least in my old field, in terms of how we make our resources available. So the reason why I'm here today is that a colleague of mine, Lisa Olsson, and I started getting a little bit frustrated with the fact that we were talking a lot about how researchers are supposed to make their material and results available to others, but we didn't really know if they did that. So there was sort of a push for these things to happen, but we felt that it was difficult to talk about this in a reasonable way with researchers when we don't actually know what their feelings and approaches and possibilities are. So we decided to do a small investigation into the matter. So that is primarily why I'm here today, is to tell you a bit about the results of this endeavor. But first, if my computer will let me move on, which it isn't, I'm just gonna stop that and try again. It's not liking it at the moment. There we go. So another reason why this has sailed up as a sort of a urgent topic and hot topic is, of course, that there is, as you might be aware, a national goal or aim to have research outputs be made openly available to the public, to other researchers, and so on. And also, as is detailed in the Research Bill of 2020, outcomes should also meet the FAIR principles. And I'm sure many of you have heard of these, but it's a set of principles that, if I can simplify it a lot, intends to make research findings more searchable, findable, possible to download and open and incorporate with your own material and material that is also described well and licensed so that you know what to do with it, what you're allowed to do. And now there's been a real shift in how we publish research articles. So we know that many articles these days are published openly with open access. But when it comes to research data, there hasn't been as much of a clear sort of progression with how we manage this type of output. But it does say in the research bill that by 2026, research data should be as open as possible. And that used to feel like that was a long ways into the future, but now we're in 2025, so it's just around the corner. And the question is where we're at with this. To give you some insights into what we have to work with at my university, I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about it. It's one of the largest ones in Sweden. We have about 5,500 members of staff, many of which are research and teaching staff, and we have roughly 1,300 doctoral students. So quite a large number of researchers to support here. We also have a little bit of an open science profile. We've been working actively with open science at the university, lots of teaching and training, but we've also had a lot of support from the university leadership. So both our previous vice chancellor and other heads have been big proponents of open science questions. So we've had a lot of support in this area. We have 4 faculties, and we're a very heterogeneous and very decentralized university. We have a natural science area with 1 faculty and a human science area with 3 faculties. And in total, we have 51 departments, centers, and institutes, which means that there are at least 51 different opinions about how research should be conducted and presented. And our researchers put out roughly somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,500 to 4,000 articles per year. So it's quite a large number of outputs. Now, I've got a horribly ugly picture for you here to look at. And the purpose of this is to give you an idea of how much the different departments publish, but also which type of material they publish. So if you just focus on the colors here, any blue bar is peer-reviewed articles. And all the orange ones are other publications like books or book chapters, reports of various kinds. And what we can immediately see is that there's a lot of variation in what kind of outputs the researchers produce. And also there's a lot of variation in how much they produce. So if we look at the biggest bars here, we can see that the Department of Physics is our most prolific department, and they publish almost only peer-reviewed articles. Whereas the third one, if you can see it, it's the Department of Law, which publishes almost no peer-reviewed articles. And so there's a big variation here in what we have to deal with. This is from 2022, and there's a reason why I show you slightly dated information here. In 2022, about 80% of these articles, the peer-reviewed ones, were published with open access, and that number has since gone up. But the reason why I'm going to talk about 2022 is because that is the year that we've collected data from. So just to give you an idea of what the landscape was in 2022. In roughly a third of these peer-reviewed publications, so about up to 1,500 articles, we had a Stockholm University corresponding author, which means that the university is the sort of legal owner of the research data produced. So one would assume that we would want to know where that data is stored and published if it is. But in truth, we don't. And that is what brings me to our question. What is the state of open data at Stockholm University? Where do our researchers publish? How do they publish? Do they publish? Well, we don't really know. We do know that data publication practices vary between disciplines a lot. So when we've been out and talked to researchers in the various departments, they can tell us a little bit about what the practices are. And often, if we're met with big question marks when we mention research data, it's because they might not even consider themselves having research data. So we know that there's a big discrepancy in how people actually treat their outputs and what research data is in their discipline. This also means that it's quite difficult to measure in a uniform way how much data is published, because if the researchers themselves don't think that they have any, how do we know if they actually put it out there? We're not the only ones to have these questions. I mean, many people talk about this now and are trying to figure out how much data is actually published online. And often people have used quantitative approaches to this, but it does come with some flaws. We've tried it as well. So what people most commonly have done is that they look at published material and use, for instance, DataCite or other databases to try to figure out how many items there are out there that are labeled with the term data set. So they try to look at these persistent identifiers, DOIs, and simply measure, quantify how many items there are that are called data sets. And when they do that, and when we do that, we can see that roughly 5 to 10% of these items that are associated with an article are labeled as research data. But we also know that it may not be the case that just because something is labeled as a data set, it doesn't mean that it actually contains research data, and it doesn't mean that it's a full data set. So what we wanted to do was to dig a little bit deeper and see if we could actually find more data. So our hope was to try to figure out if there is in fact 5 to 10% research data out there, or if researchers do it differently, which we sort of have assumed that they are. Now, before I jump into our study, I also want to mention something else, another big player in the field. When researchers are building their careers, the most important thing, as you all probably are aware of, is publishing articles. It's the best currency that they have to build a CV and a career, get grants, and so on. So often when you submit an article to a publisher, you will do whatever they say to get that article in that journal. So what we did as well was to have a little look at what kind of policies data publishers have, because we know that they are also keeping an eye on this field and developing various policies for publishing data. So here's just a sample of the largest publishers. Springer Nature strongly encourages that all research data are made available to readers without undue restriction. Thumbs up, great. Taylor and Francis and Elsevier don't really have any instructions. It's hard to find recommendations that are general for these publishers. And instead, they have varying policies across thousands of journals. So we don't really know what they think. Sage recommends data sharing. They give a thumbs up to data sharing. Whereas Wiley ranges from encouraging, expecting, to mandating data sharing, and also encourages peer review of the data in some cases. So here's just an illustration of what this can look like. So here's Wiley, British Journal of Social Psychology expects data sharing and requires researchers to publish something called a data availability statement, which is a short paragraph where you explain if there is research data, and if so, where it is and how you can get hold of it. And another Wiley journal, Ecology and Evolution, mandates data sharing. They both require you to write a statement and also that the data is actually shared. And finally, an example of a journal that mandates data sharing and where they also peer review the data set itself. So that's just to show that they are influential in sort of asking the researchers to do certain things, which of course is going to impact on what we can ask of researchers as well. All right, this is really not cooperating today. There we go. All right, so as I said, many people ask many things of researchers, and of course, our university also comes with requests. So I'm also going to show you what we recommend researchers to do in, Jesus, this is really getting frustrating. There, I have to do it this way. Yes, so Stockholm University has an open science policy as of 2022, and in there we recommend that they both publish research data and that they try to make all outputs fair. So we, when we talk to researchers, recommend that they publish their data that underpins an article, first and foremost, in a repository to make it as fair as possible. We also ask them to mention the DOI of the data in a data availability statement paragraph in that article. And we also want them to mention the DOI of the article and the repository when they publish their data as well. And we asked them to write a clear data availability statement. Doesn't have to be more than a couple of sentences detailing where the data is. And also make sure then that you link the resources together so that it shouldn't matter if you find the article first, it should be clear where the data is, or vice versa. If you happen to come across a data set that looks interesting, you should be able to also quickly find the article that's associated with that publication. And if you have sensitive data, we don't let those people get away. We recommend that you publish metadata alone. So we ask the researchers whenever it's possible to go through all the steps in the repository as another researcher would, but you stop simply at the data file upload. You don't upload anything. Instead, we can help with taking care of that research data. So this is what we ask them to do. Just a couple of things. Tell people where your research is. Link your different resources together, and be mindful of sensitive material. But here we come to the interesting part. So Lisa and I decided to take a deeper look, as I mentioned, and we did this in 2023. So we used articles from 2022 because we wanted to have a full year. And what we did was that we decided to sample a larger part of this published material. So we pulled out 10% of all the research articles that were published in 2022 and went through each and every one to manually assess them. And what we wanted to see in the first instance was whether or not they actually were empirical, because we thought there's no point assessing articles that aren't supposed to have research data. We were interested in only articles that had or should have research data. So in the first part of the study, we pulled out 63 articles that we excluded from the data set. And these were, for instance, theoretical papers, opinion pieces, review articles, and similar things. And that left us with 301 empirical articles that we based our study on. And once we had that set of articles, we decided to ask a couple of questions to our data set. We wanted to know if there was a data availability statement, of course. We also wanted to know how data was made available. Was it published in a repository and linked to with the DOI from the articles as we recommend? Was there supplementary material appended to articles? So we know that often in published articles, there might be a supplement, which could be a PDF or it could be a Word document or similar. And we know that this is quite common, so we wanted to see if they also contain data or if it was mainly methodology or statistics or your favorite table or so on. So we went through all the supplements as well and looked for data. We also looked at whether or not the articles included links to existing data sources. So when researchers perhaps use registry data or data from databases, we wanted to know if they actually linked to that material clearly. So it wasn't enough to just mention that you had used a database. You had to actually physically link to it. And then we also wanted to look at how often data was labeled as available upon request, because we know that is a common practice as well. And if there was such a label, we wanted to actually look at the data to see if it was sensitive or not. So we went through these articles looking for clear signals that the data was sensitive. And that could be, for instance, that it included ethical review or ethical vetting of the study, or it contained clearly clinical work where there might be brain scans or things that we could immediately say, okay, this is sensitive, it should not be published. So we tried to assess how often this was a reasonable statement to have. And out of the 301 articles that we went through, we saw that quite a lot actually had data availability statements. So in almost half the cases, there was such a statement. It didn't mean that they were good, but they had it. And often it would be clearly labeled in a table of contents, and it would be called something like availability of data or code or data availability or something like that. So it wasn't enough for it to just have a sentence in the method, for instance. 19% stated that data was available upon request, and in roughly half of the cases did we see that that was a very reasonable thing to do, but in half the cases there was no obvious reason why this data should not have been made available. And 21%, so almost every fifth article, didn't mention any underpinning data at all. It's as if the data had just magically appeared or been collected, but they didn't mention where the data was or how it was, if you could find it or if it was accessible. They just didn't mention it or put it in supplements or anything. And when it comes to the actual data sharing or publishing, authors often had appended supplementary material to the article. So in 46% of cases, there was some sort of appendix in the form of a PDF or Word file. It was rarely data in there. It was often other things like figures or methodology. But in 11% of the articles that we looked at, there was actually data in the supplementary material. Researchers were good at linking to existing data sources in the articles, and around 29% of the articles was there a link that actually led to data. It didn't mean that the data was immediately available, but it meant that you could trace it and figure out how to get hold of this data. And occasionally, researchers publish something with a DOI. So in 18% of the articles, there was something labeled with a DOI or pitted with a DOI and linked to. So something had been put in a repository. But when we took a closer look, we could see that only in half of those cases, or roughly 10%, was there actual research data in that DOI or in that data set. Now, if we go back, you might sum these up and go, okay, 30, 40, 50% data. But that isn't the entire truth, because when we do look at it, we could see that in some of the cases, in some articles, researchers did many of these things. Sometimes they would put a data set in a repository and put the same identical data set as a supplement in the article itself. So there were duplicates of these practices. And sometimes researchers would have a link to existing data and a repository post as well. So when we sort of clean this a bit, we could see that about 39% of our articles had some reference to underpinning data. It was either published in a repository, available as supplementary material, or they link to an existing data source. This does not mean that 39% of articles were as open as possible. It is an estimate of how much is available, but for us to truthfully say or honestly say that it was as open as possible would require us to also go into the data sets, download them, make sure they could be opened, and assess them for how complete they are compared to the journal article, for instance. So there's a lot of still gaps in this story here. And something else that I want to be transparent about is how difficult this was to assess. So as I mentioned, I have a background in biology, and my colleague Lisa comes from the field of psychology. So between us, we had some sort of discipline-specific knowledge. But as soon as we were out of our comfort zone, when we looked at physics or economy or subjects that were farther away from our own, it became really difficult to assess what actually constituted data and what was a data set. And we suddenly understood how difficult this might be, both for data stewards or support staff, but also for the researchers themselves to know which material should I publish and how can I do it. And just to show you this figure here, if you just look at the little gray bars, those are cases where we could not confidently say that it was research data or wasn't. So there was a huge sort of error margin here where there might be more data than we think there is, but we couldn't say for sure. We would have needed sort of an expert in the field to explain to us if indeed somebody had published everything in the article. Sometimes everything is in the article, or maybe a figure in chemistry could constitute the entire data set. We just could not tell. So that's one of the major flaws of trying to assess these publication practices, where we feel that you need to actually collaborate with people in the field or have very broad expertise in teams. So to draw some conclusions from all this, we're quite far from reaching the goal of fair and open data in 2026. There's a lot to be done. What we can see is that researchers do not publish data consistently, both in terms of how they publish. There's number of practices out there, but also, again, the difficulty of sort of boxing in what is a data set in different disciplines. We could see, though, that data availability statements are fairly common, which was a bit surprising, but also encouraging. Very few publish data with the DOI in repositories as we recommend, only about 10%. More publish and link to data and code. We saw a lot of GitHub code, for instance, without DOIs in databases, or link to data in existing places and sources. We see the supplementary material is still very common, and the big issue with this is that it's rarely maintained by the journal. So we know that they often have a statement saying, we will not peer review your supplements and we will not maintain them, which means that they might be linked to with a URL that in 2 years' time is gone. So if that is your only source of your data, then that could be problematic. And we also saw that it doesn't often include data, but sometimes it does. Few articles appear to be as open as possible when we look at how many people still use the phrase available upon request, even when it's not needed. But we were sort of encouraged by the study, because we could see that doing this manually and actually going over every single article meant that we could see more data than we could in a quantitative approach. So what we took away from this was that researchers are still quite open to sharing material and making it available. It again might just be that it's confusing because you have different directives from different people. And it might be hard to know what is best practice and how you do this easily. So we have some suggestions for how we can improve practices and make it easier for everyone. And we think that for researchers, they could focus on writing a data availability statements in the article so that people don't have to think too much about or search too much in an article to figure out if there is data or not. If there's a clear statement here saying, don't look for data, this was a theoretical paper, or data is sensitive and therefore you have to contact us. That is really helpful for somebody just scanning through an article. So we recommend that they do that. And we also will ask them now to distinguish data from supplementary material and avoid placing research data in any supplementary files because of the issues and constraints that I've talked about. And we know that they sometimes do this because it's an easy route. You've always done that. You just put everything in your supplement that doesn't fit in the article. But we hope that we can shift this. We also ask them to describe their data well and publish it in repositories. And the reason why we do that is because we, again, know that the publishers and the journals have so much power when it comes to influencing researchers, and they don't do it as well as we do, we have to say. So we want them to maybe step up a bit and inform researchers about best practices for publishing data and how to handle supplementary material. And we want them to encourage researchers to actually curate the data, because today many journals have started offering repository spaces or publishing routes, but it is completely uncurated, unsupported often by the journal. And so we want to push for them to actually make this a more formal process that's a bit cared for. And also that the journal itself cares for DOIs as part of their article metadata so that they don't hide this link somewhere in the middle of the article, and instead they can actually give that a more prominent position in their metadata. And as for us, higher education institutions, we can inform researchers about the value of FAIR and try to make that easier for them to both work with and understand, and also the use of DOIs. And we can offer data curation help to researchers to make this process easier so that they don't have to figure this out, by themselves, because they're very busy and they have a lot to think about. So if we can have a nice data pipeline throughout the process with support services, then I think that could really help. And then I'm going to finish off by mentioning funders. I know that is more controversial. Some people think that funders can maybe actually step in and request that data is actually managed in the way that is intended, and maybe reward or incentivize researchers. But I know from talking to researchers as well that they are not sure that that's the best route. So it's just putting them out there because they give the money and they can influence the practices. But anyways, I am going to stop there and instead hopefully get to discuss these things with you. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on data publishing. So thank you for putting up with my very messy presentation here.